I agreed with her in front of everyone, smiled like she was right, like I was just another insecure husband losing his grip. Because sometimes the fastest way to the truth is letting people believe you're too blind to see it. Olivia stood there in that soft, golden light of her friend's living room, wine glass in hand, laughing just a little too easily as she said it again. "He's paranoid, I swear, always thinking something's going on." And the room followed her lead, quiet chuckles, polite smirks, the kind of laughter that doesn't ask questions because it's more comfortable not to. I leaned back against the kitchen counter, arms folded, expression calm, letting it land, letting them all see exactly what she wanted them to see, a man slightly out of place, slightly unsure, the husband who couldn't keep up with his wife's world anymore. I didn't interrupt her. I didn't defend myself. I didn't even look surprised. Because 12 hours earlier, at exactly 11:42 p.m., while she was upstairs in the shower humming like nothing in our life had shifted, I was sitting in the dark with her phone connected to my laptop, watching a thin white progress bar crawl across the screen like it had all the time in the world. 8 years of marriage teaches you patterns, not just what someone says, but what they stop saying, the pauses, the way a phone turns face down instead of lighting up, the way a laugh sounds just slightly off, like it belongs to a different version of them. Olivia used to leave her phone anywhere, kitchen table, couch cushion, bathroom counter, like it was just another object in the house, but lately it stayed with her, always within reach, always just out of sight. I noticed it the same way you notice a draft in a room you've lived in for years, subtle at first, easy to ignore, until one day you realize the window's been open the whole time. The first time I asked about it, she smiled, brushed it off, said I was overthinking, and maybe I was. Maybe that's what men like me do when things start to slip. We try to fix it with logic, with questions, with quiet concern. But her answer came too fast, too smooth, like she'd already rehearsed it. "You're being paranoid, Ethan." She said it lightly, almost playful, but there was something underneath it, something that didn't sit right. That word stuck with me longer than it should have. Paranoid. It's a convenient label, the kind that shifts the focus, makes you the problem instead of the question you asked. So I stopped asking. I stopped watching her in the obvious ways. I let her think it worked. And then last night, when she left her phone charging by the bed and stepped into the shower, steam filling the hallway, water running steady, I made a different decision. I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate either. I picked up the phone, connected the cable, and let the machine do what it was built to do, copy everything without judgment, messages, photos, timestamps, things people forget they leave behind. The screen lit up in that dark room, quiet and clinical, no emotion, no hesitation, just data moving from one place to another, and I sat there, hands steady, watching it happen, not because I wanted to be right, but because I needed to know if I was wrong. Back in the living room, her friends were still smiling, still watching, waiting for me to react, maybe to defend myself, maybe to play along, and I gave them exactly what they expected, a small shrug, a half smile, the kind that says she's probably right, that I'm just another guy making something out of nothing. Olivia looked at me then, just for a second, checking, measuring, making sure the narrative was holding, and I met her eyes without saying a word. Because the truth wasn't in this room. Not yet. And when it showed up, it wouldn't need anyone to explain it. I stayed quiet long after the laughter faded, letting the moment settle into something ordinary, something forgettable, because the most dangerous thing you can do when people underestimate you is correct them too soon. Olivia moved through the room like nothing had happened, refilling glasses, brushing shoulders, laughing at stories that had nothing to do with us, and if someone had walked in right then, they would have seen a perfectly normal couple, the kind that hosts dinners, smiles for photos, and never gives anyone a reason to look closer. That was always her. Strength, presentation, control, the ability to shape how people saw her with just the right tone, the right expression, the right timing. I used to admire that about her. I used to think it meant we were solid, that we were the kind of couple people trusted, the kind that did not fall apart quietly behind closed doors. But standing there that night, watching her from across the room, I realized something else. She was not just controlling the room, she was controlling the narrative, And in that story, I was already written as the problem. One of her friends, a guy named Mark, leaned against the counter next to me, swirling ice in his glass like he had all the time in the world. He gave me that look, the one people give when they think they understand your situation without ever asking a real question. "Man, do not take it personally," he said, voice low, casual, like he was offering advice. "Women get tired of feeling watched. You just have to trust her." I nodded once, slow, like I was taking it in, like it made sense. "Yeah," I said, keeping my voice even. "I probably overthink things." The words felt foreign, but they fit the role. He smiled, satisfied, like he had just solved something simple. "That is how it works. People prefer easy answers. They prefer clean explanations, because the truth usually takes more effort than they are willing to give." Across the room, Olivia glanced over again, quick, almost instinctive, checking if I was still in place, still playing along, and when our eyes met, I gave her exactly what she expected, a small, almost apologetic smile. That seemed to relax her. It was subtle, but I saw it, the way her shoulders dropped just a fraction, the way her attention shifted back to the conversation without hesitation. That was the moment I knew she believed it, believed the label she had given me had stuck, that the version of me she presented to everyone else was now the version that mattered. The rest of the night moved like background noise, plates being cleared, music shifting from upbeat to something softer, conversations breaking into smaller circles, people checking their phones, calling rides, gathering coats. I helped where I needed to, carried empty glasses to the sink, wiped down the counter, moved through the motions of being present without actually being there. Every now and then, someone would make a comment, something light, something harmless on the surface. "Hey man, do not stress so much." Or, "You have got a great wife, do not mess it up." And each time I nodded, agreed, kept my tone steady, because correcting them would have required explaining something I was not ready to say out loud yet. By the time the last guest stepped out into the cool night air and the door clicked shut behind them, the house felt different, quieter, like a stage after the audience leaves, where the lights are still on but the performance is over. Olivia let out a small sigh, kicking off her heels, rubbing the back of her neck like she had just finished something exhausting. "That went well," she said, not really asking, just stating it like a fact that did not need to be challenged. I leaned against the doorway, watching her, taking in the small details, the way she avoided looking directly at me for more than a second, the way her phone stayed in her hand even now, screen dark, but present. "Yeah," I said, calm, measured. "It did." She finally looked up then, searching my face for something, maybe doubt, maybe tension, maybe the version of me she had described earlier, but she did not find it. Instead, she saw exactly what I wanted her to see, someone who had accepted her version of reality without a fight. That seemed to satisfy her. She gave a quick nod, like closing a conversation that had already been decided, and turned toward the hallway. "I am going to take a shower," she said, already moving, already done with the night. I watched her disappear around the corner, listened to the sound of the bathroom door closing, the faint rush of water starting up again, steady, predictable, almost comforting in its consistency. For a moment, the house was completely still, just the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of water running through pipes, the kind of silence that lets your thoughts get louder if you are not careful. I walked back into the living room, picked up her phone from where she had set it down on the side table without thinking, and held it in my hand for a second longer than necessary. It was warm, recently used, ordinary in every way that mattered to anyone else. I turned it over once, then set it back exactly where it had been, screen facing down, just like she always did. Because whatever was inside it was already somewhere else now, copied, stored, waiting, and for the first time that night, I felt something close to clarity settle in, not anger, not panic, just a quiet understanding that whatever came next was not going to be decided in rooms like this, with laughter and easy explanations, but in the space between what people say and what they try to hide. The water kept running behind the bathroom door, steady and unbroken, the kind of sound that makes everything else feel distant, like the world has narrowed down to a single moment you cannot step out of, and I stood there in the quiet of the living room, replaying the night in my head, not the words, not the laughter, but the spaces in between, the pauses, the looks, the things that did not quite line up. 24 hours earlier, none of this had a shape yet, it was just a feeling, something off, something I could not explain without sounding exactly like the word she used, paranoid. I remember sitting at the edge of the bed, laptop open, the glow of the screen cutting through the darkness like a question I was not sure I wanted answered, her phone in my hand, heavier than it should have been for something so ordinary. She had left it there without thinking, plugged in beside the lamp, screen lighting up once with a notification that disappeared too quickly for me to read, and that was the moment it shifted from doubt to decision. I did not hesitate long, not because I was certain, but because uncertainty had already been sitting with me for weeks, growing quietly, filling the spaces where trust used to be automatic. I connected the cable, watched the screen respond, simple, mechanical, no emotion, no judgment, just a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. Backup in progress. The words were plain, almost harmless, but they carried more weight than anything we had said to each other in months. While the data started moving, I leaned back in the chair, listening to the faint sound of water starting upstairs, the pipes humming through the walls, her presence still there but separated from me by a door, by steam, by something I could not name yet. 8 years together teaches you the rhythm of another person, the way they move through a house, the timing of their routines, the small habits that become invisible until they change. Olivia used to talk to me from the bathroom, random things, something she remembered, something she saw earlier, her voice echoing lightly over the sound of the shower. But that night there was nothing, just water, just silence. I told myself it did not mean anything, that people change, that routines shift, but the thought did not settle, it stayed there, quiet but persistent. The progress bar moved slowly, inch by inch, like it understood that what it carried could not be rushed, messages, images, call logs, pieces of a life reduced to data points, each one a record of something that happened whether I saw it or not. I remember checking the time, 11:58 p.m., then 12:07 a.m., minutes stretching longer than they should, each one giving me another chance to stop, to disconnect, to decide that not knowing was better than knowing. But I did not move. I stayed there, hands resting on the edge of the desk, eyes fixed on that thin line creeping forward, because somewhere along the way, the question had already been asked, and backing away from the answer would not erase it. Upstairs, the water shut off suddenly, the pipes ticking as they cooled, and for a second everything felt too still, like the house was holding its breath. I glanced toward the hallway, listening for footsteps, for any sign that the moment was about to collapse in on itself, but there was only the faint sound of a drawer opening, then closing, routine, normal, nothing that would raise suspicion if I had not already been looking for it. The screen flickered as another set of files transferred, numbers increasing, percentages climbing, and I realized how much of our lives we store without thinking, how easy it is to believe that what is not visible does not exist. The backup reached halfway, then past it, the line no longer hesitant, moving with quiet certainty towards something final. I exhaled slowly, not realizing I had been holding my breath, and leaned closer, as if being physically nearer would somehow prepare me for whatever was coming next. Because deep down, I already knew this was not about proving myself wrong. It was about confirming something I had been trying not to see. And once something is confirmed, once it has a shape, a record, a place you can point to and say this is real, there is no going back to the version of your life where everything still made sense. The progress bar kept moving, indifferent to all of that, steady, precise, carrying the truth one file at a time, and I stayed there in that dim light, waiting for it to finish, knowing that whatever came next would not ask for permission. I used to believe that marriages fall apart in loud moments, arguments that echo through walls, doors closing too hard, words that cannot be taken back. But the truth is it does not happen like that, it happens quietly, in small shifts you barely notice until you look back and realize everything has moved. Olivia and I did not start like this, we started simple, the kind of beginning people build futures on. Late nights in a small apartment that barely fit both of us, takeout containers stacked on the counter, laughing about things that did not matter because at the time, everything felt like it did. She used to leave notes on the fridge, nothing dramatic, just reminders, little jokes, things that made the space feel shared, like we were building something together one day at a time. I remember the first time we talked about buying a house, sitting on the floor with a laptop between us, looking at listings we could not afford yet, pointing at pictures and saying things like one day, like it was already decided. Back then, there were no secrets, no lock screens, no second thoughts about where the other person was or who they were talking to. Trust was not something we discussed, it was just there, like air, something you do not think about until it changes. The shift did not come all at once, it never does. It started with small things, the kind you excuse because they are easy to explain. She got busier at work, longer hours, more late meetings, more nights where dinner went cold before she got home. I told myself that was normal, that people grow, careers demand more, that it was part of building the life we had talked about. When she stopped leaving notes, I did not question it, I just assumed we had moved past that stage, that we did not need small gestures anymore because we had something stronger. But looking back, those small things were never small, they were signals, quiet indicators of connection, and when they disappeared, something else took their place. Conversations changed next, not dramatically, just enough to feel different. She stopped asking about my day in detail, stopped following up on things she used to care about, the projects I was working on, the people I interacted with, and when I noticed it, I told myself I was reading too much into it, that not every silence means something. But silence has a way of building, stacking on top of itself until it becomes something you cannot ignore. The house felt different over time, not physically, but in the way it held us, like we were moving through the same space but not really sharing it. Nights that used to end with conversations turned into separate routines, her scrolling through her phone, me sitting across from her, both of us present but not connected. I remember one night in particular, sitting at the dinner table, the television on in the background, either of us really watching it, and realizing we had not said more than a few words to each other in over an hour. It was not uncomfortable exactly, just unfamiliar, like being in a place you recognize but do not fully belong to anymore. That was when I first felt it, not suspicion, not yet, just distance, the kind that grows slowly, almost politely, until it becomes normal. I told myself it was a phase, that every relationship goes through it, that we would find our way back to whatever we had before. But distance does not fix itself, it settles in, it reshapes things quietly. The routine stayed, the structure of our life remained intact, bills paid, schedules followed, everything on the surface looked exactly the same, and maybe that was the problem, because when nothing looks broken, you stop looking for cracks. Sitting there in the dim light of the room with the laptop still open, the memory of those early days felt almost like something borrowed, like a version of us that existed in a different timeline, one where trust did not have to be measured or tested. The progress bar had already moved past the point where turning back made sense, but my mind stayed there for a moment, in those earlier years, trying to understand where the shift had truly started, when the version of her I knew became the version standing in the next room now, separated from me by more than just a wall. Because whatever I was about to see on that screen was not the beginning of something new, it was the result of something that had been changing for a long time, something I had felt before I ever had proof, something I had tried to ignore until ignoring it was no longer an option. I started noticing the details the way you notice a ticking sound in a quiet room, subtle at first, easy to dismiss, but once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. It was never one big moment, never something obvious enough to point at and say that is it, that is where everything changed. It was a series of small things that did not make sense on their own but felt different when you put them together. Her phone became the first pattern I could not ignore, always within reach, always angled away, always lighting up just enough for her to glance at it before the screen went dark again. She used to leave it anywhere, kitchen counter, couch, bedside table, but now it moved with her like something she could not afford to forget. I remember one morning, early, sunlight barely coming through the blinds, I was making coffee while she sat at the table scrolling, and the second I stepped closer, the screen went dark, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, just a small shift of her thumb, a reflex almost. I told myself it was nothing, that people value privacy, that not every message needs to be shared, but the timing of it stayed with me longer than it should have. Then there were the notifications, the ones that never stayed long enough to read, appearing for a second, disappearing just as quickly, like they were never meant to be seen. I caught glimpses, fragments of names I did not recognize, previews that cut off mid-sentence, and each time I asked, casually, not accusing, just curious, she had an answer ready, a coworker, a group chat, something work-related that did not need explanation. The answers were smooth, practiced without feeling rehearsed, and that was what made them difficult to challenge, because nothing about them was technically wrong, just incomplete. Nights changed too, not in obvious ways, but enough to feel off. She stayed up later, said she was catching up on emails, replying to messages, finishing things she could not get to during the day. I would go to bed first sometimes, listening to the faint tapping of her phone from the other room, a quiet, steady rhythm that carried on long after it should have stopped. One night, I woke up around 2 in the morning, the house completely dark except for a faint glow coming from the hallway. I stepped out quietly, not trying to catch anything, just following the light, and saw her sitting on the couch, screen illuminating her face, expression focused, almost intent. She looked up quickly when she noticed me, the screen tilting away just enough to break the line of sight. "Could not sleep," she said, simple, easy, like it explained everything. I nodded, said nothing, went back to bed, but the image stayed with me, the way her posture changed when she realized I was there, the way the conversation ended before it even started. Weekends felt different too, less shared, more separate. Plans became flexible in a way they had never been before, last-minute errands, quick trips that did not require details, explanations that filled space without actually saying much. I did not push, not because I did not notice, but because pushing would have forced a conversation I was not ready to have without something solid to stand on. Instead, I watched, not in an obvious way, not checking, not accusing, just observing. The shifts, the patterns that repeated often enough to become something more than coincidence. It was like watching a structure change shape slowly, one piece at a time, until the original form was no longer there, even if from the outside it still looked the same. Sitting there now, with the memory of those moments stacking up in my mind, I realized none of them had been enough on their own, but together they formed something clear, something consistent, a pattern that pointed in one direction whether I wanted it to or not. And that was the part no one talks about, the space before the truth is confirmed, when you already feel it but cannot prove it, when every instinct tells you something is wrong but every word you have sounds like doubt instead of fact. That is where I had been living for weeks, maybe longer, and that is why I did not stop the process once it started, because by then, it was no longer about suspicion, it was about clarity, about finally seeing the full picture instead of fragments. The laptop screen had already begun to fill with transferred files, silent evidence of everything I had been trying not to assume, and I sat there watching it, not with panic, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet focus that comes when you know you are about to cross a line you cannot step back from, and whatever waits on the other side is not going to be something you can ignore. The progress bar reached 100% without any sound, no notification, no confirmation, just a quiet shift on the screen that told me it was done, and for a moment I did not move, like if I stayed still long enough, I could delay whatever came next. The laptop sat there in front of me, filled with everything that used to belong to her alone, organized, labeled, accessible in a way it had never been before, and I realized how strange it was that something so personal could become so structured, reduced to folders and timestamps. Upstairs, I could hear the faint sound of a drawer closing, the soft rhythm of her moving through the room like any other night, completely unaware that the line between what was hidden and what was known had already been crossed. I exhaled slowly and leaned forward, the glow of the screen reflecting back at me, colder now, more precise, no longer just a question but something waiting to be opened. The first folder I clicked into was messages, not because I was certain that was where I would find anything, but because it was the most obvious place to start, the kind of thing people assume is private but often leave behind traces of without realizing it. The list populated quickly, names, threads, dates, some familiar, some not, all arranged in a way that made it look ordinary at a glance. For a second, I almost convinced myself that was all it was, ordinary, just a collection of conversations that meant nothing beyond what they appeared to be. But then I noticed the gaps, the way certain threads ended abruptly, the way others picked up again after hours or days with no visible context, like pieces of a conversation that had been cleaned up, trimmed down to remove something that used to be there. I clicked into one of the unfamiliar names, not expecting anything specific, just following the pattern, and what I found was not dramatic, not obvious, just a series of messages that felt too deliberate, too careful, like each word had been chosen with a purpose beyond simple conversation. There was no single line that confirmed anything on its own, no direct admission, no clear statement that could not be explained away, but the tone was different, more personal than it should have been, more intentional than casual. I scrolled slowly, reading each message in context, watching how the conversation shifted over time, from neutral to familiar, from familiar to something else that did not quite fit into any category I could easily define. It was not what was said that stood out, it was what was implied, the spaces between the words, the way certain things were referenced without being fully stated, like both sides understood something that did not need to be written down. I leaned back for a second, letting that settle, trying to approach it the way I would approach any problem, logically, without jumping to conclusions, without letting assumptions fill in the blanks. But logic only works when the information is complete, and this was anything but complete. I opened another thread, then another, each one adding a little more to the picture, not enough to confirm everything, but enough to make it impossible to dismiss. Patterns began to form, repeated phrases, similar timing, conversations that seemed disconnected at first but aligned when you looked at them together. It was not chaos, it was structure, something built carefully over time, something that existed alongside everything I thought I knew. My hand stayed steady on the keyboard, but my focus shifted, not outward, not toward reaction, but inward, toward understanding what I was actually looking at. Because this was not about catching a single moment, not about finding one message that changed everything, it was about recognizing a pattern that had been there long before I started looking for it. The screen scrolled on, more messages, more fragments, each one small on its own but heavier when combined, and I realized that whatever this was, it was not recent, it had depth, history, layers that suggested it had been building quietly over time. Upstairs, the water started again, the sound filling the house in the same steady rhythm as before, unchanged, predictable, completely disconnected from what was unfolding downstairs. I sat there in that contrast, one part of the house moving forward like nothing had shifted, the other holding something that could not be undone. And as I continued reading, piecing together what I could without forcing conclusions, one thing became clear: this was no longer a question of whether something was wrong, it was a matter of how much of it had been hidden, and how long it had been there without me seeing it. It was not just one name, and that was the part that made everything settle in a way I could not ignore, not a sudden shock, not a single moment that broke everything, but something heavier, something structured, something that had been running in parallel to my life without ever crossing into it until now. The first thread I opened had already shifted from casual to familiar, but the second one confirmed what the first only suggested: different tone, different rhythm, but the same pattern underneath, the same careful language, the same kind of messages that never said too much directly but said enough if you knew how to read them. I scrolled slower this time, paying attention to the timing, the way conversations overlapped, the way one would go quiet while another picked up, like a schedule that had been managed without being written down. Names I did not recognize at first started to repeat, not often enough to stand out immediately, but consistently enough that they formed a pattern once you stepped back and looked at the whole. I checked the timestamps, late nights, early mornings, moments that lined up with the time she said she was working, catching up, too busy to talk, and suddenly those explanations felt less like context and more like cover. I leaned back in the chair, letting my eyes move across the screen without focusing on any one message, trying to understand the structure instead of the details, because the details alone could always be explained, always be softened into something harmless if you looked at them in isolation. But together, they told a different story, one that did not rely on a single line or a single moment, one that existed in the consistency of behavior rather than the clarity of confession. I opened the photos next, not because I wanted to see something specific, but because they were part of the same system, another layer of information that might fill in the gaps the messages left behind. The gallery loaded quickly, organized by date, a timeline of moments that looked normal at a glance, dinners, small gatherings, everyday snapshots that anyone could scroll through without thinking twice. But then there were others, not inappropriate, not explicit, just out of place, images taken at times that did not match what I remembered, locations that were not part of the explanations I had been given. A restaurant I did not recognize, a table set for two, a reflection in a window that showed more than it was meant to, small details that did not stand out unless you were looking for them. I clicked into one image and held it there for a second, not because of what it showed directly, but because of what it suggested, a moment that existed without me, a version of her life that had been running quietly alongside ours. I set the phone down next to the laptop for a second, pressing my fingers against the edge of the desk, grounding myself in something physical, something real, because the screen in front of me was starting to feel detached from everything I thought I knew. Upstairs, the water stopped again, the pipe settling into silence, and I knew she would be moving through the room now, drying her hair, checking her phone, stepping back into the version of the night that still made sense to her. I glanced at the clock, noting the time without really thinking about it, just marking it the way you do when something important is happening even if you cannot define exactly what it is yet. I went back to the messages, this time not searching, not trying to confirm anything new, just reading, letting the pattern speak for itself, letting the consistency of it replace any need for speculation. Because by then, it was no longer about whether something was happening, it was about understanding the scale of it, the length of time it had been there, the level of intention it required to maintain something like this without it ever becoming obvious enough to confront. And that was when it became clear in a way that did not rely on any single piece of evidence, not one message, not one photo, not one name, but all of it together, aligned, structured, undeniable in its consistency. This was not a mistake, not a moment, not something that happened once and ended. It was ongoing, managed, built into the spaces where I had assumed nothing was happening at all. I sat there in that realization, not reacting, not moving, just letting it settle, because once something becomes that clear, once it reaches that level of certainty, there is no immediate response that makes sense. There is only understanding, and understanding takes time, even when the truth is already in front of you. Once the pattern settled into something undeniable, the instinct to react was there for a moment, sharp and immediate, the kind that tells you to walk upstairs, to say something, to force the truth into the open while it is still fresh and undeniable, but that instinct passed just as quickly as it came, replaced by something quieter, something more controlled. Because reacting in that moment would not have given me anything I did not already have, and it would have taken away the only advantage I had left, clarity. I closed the messages slowly, not because I was done, but because I had seen enough to understand what I was dealing with, and understanding changes how you move. The laptop screen dimmed slightly as it idled, the files still there, intact, organized, waiting, and I realized that whatever happened next would not be decided by what I felt in that moment, but by what I chose to do with what I knew. Upstairs, I could hear her moving again, light footsteps across the floor, the soft sound of a drawer sliding shut, everything normal, everything consistent with the version of the night she believed she was in. I reached for the laptop and began organizing the files, not hurried, not frantic, just methodical, copying everything to a separate drive, labeling folders by date, making sure nothing was left in a single place where it could be lost or questioned. It felt less like searching and more like securing, like preparing for something that had not happened yet but was already in motion. I'd open the call logs next, not expecting anything different, but wanting to see how it aligned with everything else, and it did, times that matched the gaps in conversations, durations that explained the late nights, numbers that appeared just often enough to matter. There was no single piece that carried everything, but together they formed a structure that did not leave room for doubt. I checked the calendar entries after that, small details that most people do not think about, but they told their own story, blocks of time marked as work, meetings that did not exist in any context I could verify, gaps that lined up too cleanly with everything else I had seen. It was all there, not hidden well enough to disappear, just organized well enough to avoid being questioned. I leaned back in the chair again, letting the weight of it settle, not as a shock, not anymore, but as something defined, something that had moved past suspicion into certainty. The difference between those two is quiet but absolute, and once you cross it, everything else becomes clearer, not easier, but clearer. I looked around the room for a moment, the same space that had held years of routine, of normalcy, of assumptions that no longer fit the reality I was now looking at. Nothing had physically changed, the furniture, the lighting, the small details that made it familiar, but the meaning behind it had shifted completely. I closed the laptop halfway, not shutting it down, just enough to dim the screen, to create a pause between what I had seen and what I would do next. Because this was not the kind of situation that benefits from immediate confrontation, not when the other person is already controlling the narrative, already shaping how events are perceived before they are even questioned. If I walked upstairs now, if I said anything based on what I had just found, it would turn into a conversation I could not control, one where words would be deflected, minimized, reframed, where evidence would be questioned before it could be fully presented. I had seen enough to know how that would play out. So instead, I chose something else, something simpler and more effective. I decided to wait. Not passively, not ignoring what I knew, but intentionally, using the time to make sure that when the moment came, it would not rely on interpretation or explanation, it would stand on its own. I picked up the external drive and set it aside, out of immediate sight but within reach, a small, quiet anchor to everything I had just uncovered. Upstairs, the sound of movement shifted again, closer now, the kind that meant she would be coming back into the room soon, stepping back into the version of the night that still made sense to her. I stood up slowly, adjusting my posture, letting my expression settle into something neutral, something that matched the role I had already been playing. Because for now, nothing had changed in her world, and that was exactly how I needed it to stay, at least until I was ready for it not to be. She walked back into the room like nothing had changed, hair still slightly damp, phone already back in her hand, moving with the same ease, the same rhythm I had watched all night, and for a second I saw it clearly, the separation between what she believed this moment was and what it had already become. "You are still up?" she asked, casual, almost distracted, like the question did not carry any weight beyond filling the silence. I nodded once, leaning against the counter, posture relaxed, expression neutral, exactly what she expected to see. "Could not sleep," I said, keeping my tone even, matching hers, letting the words settle without anything behind them that could be questioned. She glanced at me for a moment, just long enough to check, to confirm that everything was still in place, that the version of me she had presented earlier had not shifted into something else. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her, because she looked away just as quickly, moving toward the kitchen, setting her phone down face down on the counter for the briefest second before picking it up again like it was part of her routine. I watched that small movement, not reacting, not focusing on it outwardly, but marking it the way I had been marking everything else, quietly, without interruption. "I think everyone had a good time tonight," she said, opening the fridge, scanning it without really looking, more out of habit than intention. "Yeah," I replied, the same calm tone, the same controlled delivery. "They did." She closed the fridge, leaned back against it, arms crossing lightly, and for a moment there was a pause, not uncomfortable, just empty, like a space waiting to be filled with something neither of us was ready to say. That was the difference now, I realized, not just what I knew, but what I did not need to say anymore. Before, I would have filled that silence, asked a question, made a comment, tried to pull us back into something familiar, but now I let it sit, let it exist without forcing it into something else. She shifted slightly, glancing at her phone again, thumb brushing across the screen in that same quick motion I had seen so many times before, and then she smiled faintly, like something there had confirmed. Something for her, something I was no longer part of. "I am going to head to bed," she said, pushing off the fridge, already turning toward the hallway. I nodded again, not stopping her, not following, just watching as she moved out of the room, footsteps soft against the floor, the sound fading as she disappeared around the corner. The house settled into silence again, the kind that feels different once you understand what sits underneath it. I waited a few seconds after she was gone, not because I needed to, but because I was used to moving carefully now. Then I walked over to the counter and looked at the spot where her phone had been, empty again, like it had never been there at all. I did not reach for anything this time, did not check, did not search, because I did not need to. Everything I needed was already somewhere else, stored, organized, waiting. I picked up the external drive from where I had set it aside earlier, feeling its weight in my hand, small, unremarkable, but holding more than anything in this house right now. I turned off the laptop completely this time, the screen going dark, the room returning to its normal lighting, as if nothing had happened at all. But something had. Not loudly, not visibly, but in a way that could not be undone. I stood there for a moment, letting that settle, not rushing into the next step, not forcing a reaction, just understanding where things were now. Because this was no longer about discovering anything new. That part was done. This was about what came next, and what came next was not going to happen in a moment of emotion or confrontation. It was going to happen with the same control, the same precision that had brought me here in the first place. I set the drive down carefully, out of sight but within reach, then turned toward the hallway, not to follow her, not yet, but to move forward in a way that made sense now. Because the truth does not need to be announced the moment you find it. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let it sit, let it exist quietly, until the moment it speaks for itself. And when it does, there is nothing left to argue, nothing left to explain, just a clear line between what was said and what was real.